Welcome to the Dr. and Mrs. Curry podcast, where the emphasis is on parenting related matters. I am Dr. Joshua John Curry, and with me is my better half, Mrs. Cartrisa Lynn Curry. Today's episode will concentrate on parent children communication. We will focus on effective communication between parents and children from an all inclusive manner. We're going to jump right in with the subtopic of self doubt. Now, when it comes to parenting, I've worked with and countless parents throughout my professional career. I always tell parents, I like to remind us that we as parents, there are going to be days in which we're doing great, and there's going to be days in which we've sat back and said to ourselves, "What was I thinking? What have I done?" And I always like to at least offer the recommendation of it's not about beating yourself up over mistakes you've made. We are human beings, and unfortunately, as human beings, we do come with our flaws. We are not flawless. I like to look at those mistakes that we've made. Perhaps if we went left when we should have gone right, or vice versa, we've gone right in which we should have gone left. It's not about beating yourself up theoretically over the mistake you've made. It's about recognizing the mistake. It's about learning from that mistake. And perhaps most importantly, if we're able to do so, it's about not perpetuating that mistake, not duplicating that mistake, making certain that that particular mistake or those mistakes are not repeated on an ongoing basis. And self-doubt is something that could creep in, and it could be something that we as parents, it could position us to say, you know what, perhaps I am not doing the best job that I could be doing. And rather than making those particular adjustments, we get to a point in which we parent half-heartedly, so to speak. We're not giving 100% because that doubt is there. We look at others, perhaps others have what we perceive to be a better profession, a better career. This person may have their own vehicle, a nice vehicle, rather than using public transportation. This person may own a very nice home, when in fact we look at ourselves and say, I'm renting what perhaps may not be the most luxurious place. A recommendation that I make to parents working as a board certified family recovery specialist, I like to offer the recommendation, let's not compare ourselves to others. Let's just focus within ourselves as parents. Let's focus on our children. Let's focus on what we have as far as our familial or our household dynamic. And let's do what we can to continue building upon that foundation. Let's not overwhelm ourselves with what this particular family may perhaps be doing or may not be doing, because essentially we are outsiders looking in. And what I dive into is that something could be perceived to be greener as far as the grass being greener on the other side. But if you were to actually dive into, or if you were privy to the actual details and the nuances of what's taking place with this particular family, the grass may perhaps not be greener. So I just like to offer those suggestions as parents. Let's just focus on what we have going on within our respective dynamic and do the best that we can to move forward and becoming the best versions of parents as possible. And I do strongly believe that that starts with communication. We communicate with our children, particularly during those occurrences. And there are circumstances in which we may have made a decision that perhaps wasn't the best. I encourage parents, communicate with your children. And we're going to cover an assortment of subtopics today. And I'm going to dive into what you and I have done with our two children, communicated with them at a very young age about what's taking place, about what's going on in the world, about what could happen to them from a short term and from a long term perspective. And I do believe with that level of communication, with a sufficient level of communication, that could put us in a position to at least diminish doubt. We as parents, we're always going to have doubt. We're always going to say, okay, could I have done this better? Could I do that better? Things that took place in the past. Why did I make that decision? And speaking of the past, this is where I dive into, I sort of alluded to it not too long ago, but whatever took place in the past, which may have us shaking our heads, let's not ignore it. Let's learn from it. Let's use that as a life lesson. I do brag about our daughter very often with whomever will allow me to. With her playing basketball, being very successful. Whenever one of her teams lose, I'll say to her, hey, losses are going to happen, not just in basketball, but in sports, any sport you're involved in. They're going to happen academically. They're going to happen in life in general. I like to remind our daughter, just trying to do the best job that I can as her father. I say, let's take those losses. Let's not beat ourselves down about it. Let's learn what happened. Let's identify what happened. What could we have done better? And let's work on that foundation. Let's make those adjustments. So if and when we are in that position, which we perhaps will be at some point in the distant future, whether near or far, when we're presented with those particular circumstances, we're going to recognize it and we can easily make those adjustments. So perhaps we're now in a position to have a heightened chance of experiencing success rather than going through those proverbial losses again, so to speak. Now, from your standpoint, when it comes to that self doubt creeping in as parents, what would you recommend to a parent who's listening right now that perhaps saying to himself or herself that maybe I'm not the best parent that I could be? Perhaps my child or children is better off with an aunt, with an uncle, with a grandmother, grandfather, or even in foster care, or perhaps being adopted out. What would you recommend to a parent who perhaps having these doubt related cognitions and feelings that could be perhaps overwhelming them so they can at least diminish those related symptoms and they can focus on becoming the best version of a parent that they could be?
I would actually, I would recommend if you have family that you're close with or that is on a you're on a good standing with, and that they're encouraging family members that are encouraging. I would recommend talking to them, because something that you feel like you may be failing at, you may not necessarily be failing at. It may just be a like as kids get older, they start to be able to speak their mind more and start to be able to articulate more what they want and what they feel. And yes, there are times where they're going to say that they don't like you and that you're not their best friend anymore, which our 3-year-old likes to do all the time now. But it's not about taking to heart what they're saying at that exact moment, because what you're doing is in the benefit of them. So sometimes it's good to get another adult's perspective from someone that you respect, and that's someone that is encouraging to you, not someone that puts you down all the time. But if you have a circle of girlfriends that maybe they have kids too, or a circle of male friends that have kids, it's good sometimes to bounce ideas off of other parents and explain the situation that happened. And sometimes, parenting groups are good because they either, if they have older children than you have, they've gone through it. Or if your kids are the same age, they're going through it at the same time. So it helps so that you don't feel like you're out there in the wind just failing on your own, because you're not. You're just doing the best you can. So having family and friends and parenting groups, just having someone to talk to and bounce it off of, so that way you can get a different perspective instead of being so insulated within yourself on how you're feeling. If you just speak about it to someone within that group of people, they'll be able to help you work through that insulated feeling that you're having so you can see it from the other side.
I wanted us to create this parenting related platform because I wholeheartedly believe that there's an assortment of complications and concerns that we as parents in general that we go through. And like you made mentioning of having that level of support from a parenting perspective. I've seen personally and professionally, there's a lot of people that unfortunately don't have that level of support. So my intentions, I did have quite a bit of intentions with this particular platform that you and I have here. I was hoping that this could be used as a porter, as a system of support, essentially for someone. And there are a lot of people. I wanted to share a particular client that I'm currently working with. When he turned 21 years old, he had a he became he was a father, and quickly thereafter he had 4 kids. So he found himself being 25 years old with 4 kids, and he was working 2 full-time jobs to support his family. So he was doing a very great job as far as that. He was involved with each of his children. He was very supportive with his significant other, with the mother of his children. They were not married. They were still relatively young, but they were still working some things out as far as progressing towards getting married. They were building their lives together. Here's where the complications came in. With him being 25 years old, he's working 2 full-time jobs. What he did, he associated with his peers, with his coworkers who were in his age bracket. So they were in their mid to early 20s. What was taking place was he would come back to work on Monday, everyone sitting around the water cooler, everyone sitting around the table. And they were talking about particularly the male counterparts that he had, the male coworkers that he had. These gentlemen were single. They did not have any children, so their weekends were spent going out to clubs, to the party scenes. These individuals had one bedroom apartments. They had they had cars, they had trucks, they had motorcycles, they had jet skis, they had boats. All of these things that could be typical of a young man in his early 20s who's working, and that's definitely something that he deserves, and that's surely something that he should have at that particular point in his life, particularly if he doesn't have any responsibilities from a parenting standpoint. The gentleman whom I'm working with, he found himself being very envious of what was taking place of his counterparts. He shared with me that he was very happy for them, but he also felt as though that he was missing out in life because here he is working two full-time jobs. All of his finances were geared towards tuition, karate practice, dance recitals, uh, basketball practices, football equipment, bills, and things of that nature. He found himself struggling because he wasn't able to have a vehicle of his own. He was utilizing public transportation to get around. So he found himself saying to himself, here I am working two full-time jobs, 5 days a week. I'm working 16 hours a day. But at the end of the week, I have no money to show for it because money is spent on groceries and the other things that I mentioned. So this, unfortunately, he developed these circumstances positioned him to develop a level of resentment that at first he didn't notice. He was taking his frustrations out on his significant other and their four children. This in turn led to them going through some very traumatic circumstances, including psychiatric hospitalizations, incarcerations, and things of that nature. In the end, they ended up living in two different cities. So this positioned him to not have much, if any, involvement with his four children over the course of years. That level of resentment, even though we've now a significant amount of years have passed, but he still finds himself experiencing this resentment. What I've been working with him on is the identification of what took place, surrounding himself with a center of influence that includes parents, that includes fathers, that perhaps includes someone older that he could lean upon as far as wisdom, someone whom he respects unconditionally, rather than affiliating with peers. So even though he's a little older now, in his peer group, they've now reached a point in which their parents, their fathers themselves. I like to always encourage someone, if you're able to, identify someone who's perhaps a little older, whether that be an aunt, an uncle, parent, grandparent, or even someone who just close to you that you just respect, perhaps a mentor from work, someone who was a steward to you in college, or something along those lines, just someone whom you respect unconditionally. And you know wholeheartedly that whatever guidance or recommendations they're going to offer you is going to be something that, not that you want to hear, but that you need to hear. But along the lines of what you mentioned, that's something that I truly believe in. Let's find that center of influence. Let's find that person or people in which we respect. They have that wisdom. They've walked in those shoes, so to speak. The gentleman that I just mentioned, he would share with me that he would take his concerns and his frustrations to work. So rather than seeking out that 40-year-old, that 42-year-old who perhaps been a father for several years, who've worked through those frustrations, who've gone through those levels of perhaps even resentment, he would share his and he would vent to his peers whom were in their early 20s. They couldn't identify, they couldn't empathize, they couldn't understand what he was going through. So the advice that he shared me that he was getting was, hey, just leave them, just get yourself on child support and just leave your family and live your life essentially. And that's very unfortunate. But he had told me that this was recommendations that was offered to him from countless coworkers and associates. But of course, they were also in their early to mid 20s, so they didn't have that level of parenting related maturity to even be in a position to offer him any recommendations. But that was something like you mentioned along those lines. That's definitely something that I like to offer people, and hopefully someone who's listening to this, if this is something that they could utilize, or perhaps maybe even someone they know that could utilize, please feel free to share that recommendation. Let's go out there and if we can, let's identify someone, like I mentioned, who have that, who have access to that proverbial blueprint, who've walked in those shoes, who've ventured along that path, and they can identify certain mistakes or matters that perhaps could have gone differently, and they can point you in the appropriate direction. And speaking of which, this is where I want to transition into parents. I did mention with our first episode, there's going to be topics and subtopics that could be somewhat uncomfortable, but this is why I want this platform to be from an all-inclusive manner. We're not going to be judgmental. That's not the intention. We're not looking to beat anyone down. We're just looking to identify mistakes or perhaps misappropriations that are taking place as parents. Let's identify those, and let's at least offer recommendations that we could utilize to perhaps even position ourselves to change even slightly, if not significantly. What I wanted to transition into is parents being involved with substance abuse with their children, and remaining along the lines of parent-children communication. Contemporary literature has ascertained that even if parents struggle with active addiction or engage in some form of recreational substance abuse, and the child knows about it, the child is aware about these activities and behaviors, research indicates that if a parent says, hey, despite what I'm doing and I'm working myself through things programmatically or from a rehabilitative standpoint, I am not supportive of you as my child, or you as my children, or you all as my children, duplicating my behavior. So I'm going through some psychological challenges, whether that be through self-medication or iatrogenic dependence or a level of tolerance that's been developed over the course of time because of substance abuse. If this is taking place with a parent, contemporary literature shows that we as parents must identify the challenges that we're going through, but also let the child know that this is not something that I'm supportive of. Throughout my personal life and professionally, of course, working in the field, I come across an array of parents whom are not only aware of their children engaged in substance abuse, but also support it from a monetary standpoint, and even engaged in substance abuse with their children. And of course, not being judgmental, I just wanted to utilize this particular time to offer some suggestions, offer some recommendations, offer even perhaps some psychoeducation so we can get those matters turned around. Many years ago, I was during my adolescent years, I spent some time on probation. I went to a relative's home. They had no idea I was coming. I was in the area. So just trying to be a good family member. I'm in your area. I'm just going to knock on your door just to say hello. So I entered this relative's home. I wanted to go see a relative of mine, and I entered the home. And this was an adolescent, so a peer of mine. I entered the home, and there were countless of her associates. I don't like to use the term friend. I truly believe that as someone's supportive of you engaging in substance abuse, I at least want us to reconsider how we term that particular person, how we categorize that person. Is this person a friend of mine? As far as my individualized definition of a friend is someone who cares about you, loves you, and supports you unconditionally. They're going to do the best that they can to make certain you're not involved in any activities that could be detrimental to your well-being. They want to see the best in you. They want to see you accomplish everything that you set out to, and they want to support you in any manner in which they can from a pro-social standpoint. So going back to this relative's home, I enter the home and I look around and I just see a bunch of teenagers. And remember, this is, like I just mentioned, this was during my adolescent years. So at the time, I was a teenager myself. So my relative's mother entered the indoor porch, and I asked her. I said, "What's going on here? Why are we?" There was just there was an array of drugs and alcohol just right there, and everyone whom was on the indoor porch was engaging in substance abuse. And she had sat down and she joined them. So she was supportive of it. She had shared with me that she had financed the endeavor, and this was something that takes place within her household. She was also aware that I was on probation for, of course, something that was unrelated. And I told her that, of course, this is wrong. I'm just paraphrasing. This was well over 20 years ago, but I just told her that this is wrong. And, that we know that the loved one that I'm talking about at the time, she was going through some struggles. So we as her family, we must help her out, not perpetuate or not be in a position to encourage what's taking place. So she had threatened to call the police on me. I told her that that's okay. I am on probation. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm on probation for something that happened at the time that happened over 1 year ago. I was reprimanded for that. And part of my probation, I said we were in the process of finalizing my obligation with the criminal justice system. So I had reminded her that I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm on probation for something that took place a year ago at that particular time. I said, if you do call the police, and I will gladly stay here, do you think they're going to be worried about what I did 1 year ago? Or are they going to be worried about the potential child endangerment charges and things along those lines that you're involved with essentially financing and supporting and enabling all of these adolescents that are in your home engaging in substance abuse? We have to also be worried about the parents of these teenagers. Are any of these parents even aware of where their children were at the time? Do they have any knowledge of what's taking place? Now transitioning into my professional life, I've worked with an assortment of parents as well as their children during family counseling sessions. And we're talking about children being involved with substance abuse. And either the child or the children or the parents will share with me that, yes, my mother, or yes, my father, or yes, my guardian is not only aware, but they do it with me. I can go to my mother's room and say, hey, can I get X amount of dollars to go out and purchase this particular chemical or these particular chemicals? And the parents will do it. So I'll ask parents, just being non-judgmental, why do we enable? Why do we support? Why do we encourage? Why do we allow these activities to unfold, to manifest themselves? And the vast majority of the times, I'm told that we as parents, we do know that our children are going to be out there and they're going to essentially do whatever they want to do whenever they're not under our supervision directly. And yes, that is true. A child is going to make his or her own decision. But what I dive into, I said, this is why it's very important for us to communicate rather than enable or turn the blind eye, so to speak. Let's communicate about what engaging in substance abuse could do to you, about the perhaps irreversible neurological damage, about perhaps the physical ailments that you could succumb to, about getting involved with the criminal justice system, about engaging with antisocial personalities, people who perhaps they don't have any disregard for not only your life, their lives either. So they can care less about any physical harm that can be done to you. I share with parents, let's communicate about what happens in the world from a realistic standpoint. Now, from your personal and professional experiences, why are there parents out there? And of course, we're not being judgmental. We're just trying to offer a platform to at least start the dialogue, to engage in communication. Why do parents find it problematical as far as enabling, financially supporting, and turning a blind eye to their children being involved with substance abuse, even to the point in which they involve themselves in chemical abuse with their children? Why does this happen with parents?
I think some parents think that if they're looking at it as like they're supporting their kid. And I think some parents look at it as, well, if they're doing it here with me, at least I know they're safe. But when it all boils down to it, if you tell them and you express to them and explain to them the detriment that it can all cause, like, they see what you're going through as a parent. So if you are involved in active addiction in some way, some form, they see what your struggles are. But if you don't explain to them that this is what caused those struggles, they're not going to see it as a negative aspect. They're not going to see it as that's what's making things so hard for you. So I think some parents that are involved with substance abuse, I think I think they participate in enabling their kid to do it because then they feel like there's no judgment from their kid and them being in active addiction. So if their kid is, if they're encouraging or enabling their kid to do these things, then their kid isn't judging them or looking at them with a side eye for them doing it or picking at them or anything like that anymore. But as parents, we can't always do things that are going to make our life not necessarily easier, but our relationship with our kids in a particular way. You can't do something that's detrimental for their health just because it makes your life easier for 5 minutes. If you are going through active addiction with any form of substance, but you're actually trying to get better, it's better to sit down with your child and explain what's going on. Tell them the steps. Tell them, hey, I was your age when I first tried this, and now I've been fighting to get over this and fighting to be done with this for however how many years. Don't enable them and don't buy it for them, because then, or to explain to them if they come to you and ask for it, explain to them that like I said, I was your age when I did that, and this is where I am now. But you have something that you can do. You can be better than me. You can go farther than me. So let's not do this. How about we go to the park? How about we go to an amusement park? How about we go to an arcade or something? Just find something else for them to do to take their mind off of it. And if you tell them your story and explain to them the ins and outs of your story, that is stay in the back of their mind when a friend or anyone else approaches them with it. And they'll sit there and they'll think about it, and they have a higher likelihood of turning it down and not getting involved.
Let's propose a hypothetical scenario. Someone under those conditions that we just spoke of, they're in the process of watching this episode, or they're in the process of they've just watched this episode. They're engaged in these circumstances. This is their life. So they're saying to themselves, I have been contemplating within myself to at least attempt to position myself to no longer do this. What could we offer that parent? Because their child or children or neighborhood children, they have the expectation that tonight or tomorrow or this weekend, we're all going over to Josh's house and we're going to party, we're going to drink, we're going to smoke, we're going to pop pills, we're going to do all types of things. So what can we offer that parent for him or her to say, enough's enough, it's over? Now they're going to be met with a lot of resistance. They're going to be met with a lot of disappointments. They may perhaps even be met if one of the teenagers or adolescents are brazen enough, they may perhaps be met with some form of threats or blackmailing, to the point in which one of the teenagers could say, hypothetically, of course, well, if you don't allow this to happen, I'm going to report this to law enforcement or to Child Protective Services, and we are going to transition into Child Protective Services here shortly. So this could be something that a mother or a father or a guardian could experience. This could be their life. So what could we recommend to that particular adult that's saying to themselves, okay, you know what, I want to stop this now. But like I mentioned, they could have that level of resistance, threats, and blackmailing that they could be exposed to. I want to use my imagination, and I would like to at least make that assumption that when these parties or gatherings are cut off, an adolescent or a group of adolescents are not just going to say, okay, that's fine, we respect that, and they're not just going to walk away quietly. What could we offer that adult whom's perhaps they've ingratiated themselves into these particular groups, and these children essentially feel as though that we are peers. They feel as though that we are friends. And from a communication standpoint, with that being our predominant topic during this episode, I've talked with our daughter throughout her life. I've been sharing stories about the world with her since she was 2 years old. And of course, as you know, I'm replicating that with our son, who's 3 years old now. I've always told her that on top of everything, on top of any title that I'll have, whether temporarily or permanently throughout your life, throughout our relationship, throughout our time together while we're on this planet at the same time. I'm going to be your father first. Anything else that's secondary, that's tertiary, that's supplementary, that's additional. I'm your father first. Any decisions or any engagements that you and I have together, and this applies to our son as well. I'm your father first. As far as being a friend or anything along those lines, like I just mentioned, all of that is secondary, tertiary, supplementary. I'm your father first. We are not peers. Our relationship will not be like that. Even as we transition into adulthood, I at least want to do a great job as a father. So even as she transitions into adulthood, that level of respect will always remain intact. In which that she'll look at me and our son will look at me as, even though we are all adults, we're going through early adulthood, middle adulthood, and God willing, late adulthood, despite where we're at as far as the stages of development across our lifespan, we're still not friends. We're still not peers. I'm your father first, and everything else, like I mentioned, is secondary, tertiary, supplementary. But you and I both know that there are parents out there, circumstances took place, of course, not being judgmental, in which those boundaries have been blurred. So now the mother, the father, the guardian, now they are essentially friends with their children. So now telling a peer what to do, now trying to reassume that parental categorization could be a little bit challenging. And that's why I mentioned that they could be met. There is a heightened chance they could be met with that level of resistance and perhaps even threats and blackmailing. So, what can we offer that person who perhaps is listening to this or will listen to this, and they say to themselves, that is my life, and I'm trying to do better. I am very ashamed of what I allowed to do, but I feel as though that I am so far ingratiated. I am so far entrenched into what's taking place. It's going to be challenging for me to just walk away. It's going to be very problematical for me to end these gatherings, to end these parties, particularly because of the household or perhaps even community expectations of this home being the gathering site, this home being synonymous with adolescent parties being hosted. So, what can we offer that person to end this as quickly as possible?
I would say the first thing you need to do is just end it. Like, honestly, it's like ripping off a band-aid. Just do it. So you end in that portion of it. Like, you don't have to end it being the hangout spot, because you can have fun activities for them there at your home without involving illegal substances, or illegal for them because they're underage. And it's time to have a conversation and explain, hey, I am your parent. I am an adult. This is wrong. Yes, you may try and do this and say this and feel this type of way, but I'm not saying you guys can't hang out here. I'd love to have you hang out here, but we're not gonna be doing those things anymore. We can have game nights, we can have movie nights, everyone can still come over and hang out. We'll have popcorn, we'll have soda, we'll have pizza, we'll have all this stuff, but it will be all clean. There won't be any illegal things. There won't be any of those types of parties. We can still have parties, but it won't be those types of parties. And I think if you take away all of it at once, you're going to have more problems. But I think if you take away the illegal part of it, the providing it and the just turning the blind eye while it's happening, even if you're not sitting there, take that part away from it. Don't take away the hangout spot. They can still come and hang out, but just let it be known that there will be no alcohol, there will be no illegal substances. It will be sodas, it will be water, it will be juice, it will be Pepsi, it will be pizza and popcorn and candy and all of that. So, and then just honestly, I think, in my opinion, kids are more, they talk more than they actually do. They may threaten you, but I can't say that I don't foresee, because there are kids that would do that, but there's more that would not. There's more that are just going to say it and not do it, as far as calling the police on you or threatening you with telling authorities that you used to do this. But they also have to take into effect that, yes, you're an adult and you were doing it, but you're no longer doing it. So the consequences are still going to be there for if you're reported and they find it to be true, but the consequences aren't going to be as bad as if you're still actively doing it. I say take away all the illegal aspects of it, have a conversation with your child separate, and then have a conversation with all the kids and just tell them, still hang out here. We'll watch movies, you can have parties, clean parties. You know, I'm not saying that you guys can never come over again. You just can't do the illegal part.
Speaking along those lines of the illegal aspect of things and everything changing, like you mentioned, when it comes to adolescence, of course, there are some out there that we all know that could be brazen enough to follow through with their threats, but for the most part, those threats could be relatively idle. They may not be followed through with, but there are adolescents out there without any regard of how them carrying out those threats could impact the lives of many, perhaps even including themselves, perhaps even including their loved ones, even their household. This is something that could take place, which could include the involvement of Child Protective Services. Now, you and I, we're living and working in southwestern Pennsylvania, at least as far as Child Protective Services, regardless of the precise terminology, which varies from county to county, but Child Protective Services as an umbrella, involvement with them in southwestern Pennsylvania, at least from what I've seen since we as a family relocated to this particular part of the country, involvement with them could last 1 to 2 years. In some cases, I've seen even longer. It could be something in which a family is involved, cases are closed out, and then within a couple of weeks, a few months, the process is commenced again and is perpetuated. And then we're going through another year or two, or perhaps even longer, of ongoing involvement with Child Protective Services. We were just talking along the lines of parents engaging in substance abuse with their children, supporting it financially, enabling it, allowing their home to be the literal gathering place for this all to take place, for this all to unfold. Going into the lines of Child Protective Services, we're talking about parent-children communication. Involvement with Child Protective Services could include substance abuse classes, rehabilitative treatment as far as psychiatric or mental health. It could include recidivism prevention, parenting courses, anger management curriculum, and that list could go on and on and on. I've worked with, and I'm in the process of currently at the time of this recording, working with an array of parents whom unfortunately had some unfortunate things take place with them, and now they're involved with Child Protective Services, or they've been involved with Child Protective Services. And in some cases, this is something that's happened multi-generationally. It's something that's happened with each of their children. I'm talking about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children. This is something that parents provided clinical services for. They've essentially, from their self-disclosure, they've mentioned that involvement with Child Protective Services is something that they've made synonymous with parenting, with parenthood. They feel as though this is something that eventually will happen to them, no matter how hard they try to be the best version of a parent that they could be. So now we're talking about parent-children communication. We have a child that's wanting to perhaps go to a football game and wanting to sign up for football. But the parent comes to the realization that all of these football practices or all of these football games that the child is in a position to be signed up for, they're going to be around the times of other obligations that must be tended to. Like I just mentioned, we're talking about substance abuse treatment, mental health, psychiatric treatment. We're talking about recidivism prevention, anger management, and things of that nature, parenting courses. So the parent must tell their child that unfortunately, we're not able to play football, at least during this season, or at least during this year, because you and I have all of this stuff that we must do collaboratively to get Child Protective Services out of our lives. So now the child is asking why. And I've been in situations going back to us being parents first and not being friends, at least having that friendship with your child being the primary dynamic, not being peers. So I've noticed that this is when the parent will say, I'm the adult, you're the child. I'm the parent, you're the child. You don't get to ask me why we have to go here. I'm telling you to get yourself prepared. We're going here, and that's that. What I like to offer parents and diving back into where parents first and being friends with your child or children, that's something that's secondary, tertiary, supplementary. But we're talking about communication. I at least like to offer the recommendation or the suggestion that if you're involved with Child Protective Services, that does not mean you're a bad or unfit parent. That just means unfortunate circumstances unfolded in your life or in the lives of you and your child or children associated with your household dynamic. Child Protective Services were notified because of concerns, and now we're involved in it. And now we have to fulfill these obligations. And I always remind parents that this is something that could happen to any of us. We are human beings, and like I mentioned at the onset of this episode, we are not perfect. We do have flaws. So any of us could have a bad day, find ourselves involved with an indecision, and before you know it, we've crossed some lines, we ventured across some particular boundary. Now we're involved with Child Protective Services. It can happen to anyone. And I remind everyone this can happen literally to any family, to any parent child dynamic. But now we have a child asking, okay, I've been obligated to go here, hypothetically, 2, 3, 4 days a week. And this has been taking place for over a year. This is hindering my social development. This is hindering my involvement. And this is the child talking. This is hindering my involvement with recreational activities. Why do we have to do this? How long do we have to do this? When did this come to an end? From your standpoint, why do parents find it so challenging to sit down and articulate and intellectualize why involvement with Child Protective Services is something that they're obligated to be involved with as far as them communicating everything between them and their children? Why is this so challenging for some parents?
I think some parents find a conversation like that uncomfortable. So it's just easier to say, well, I'm the adult, you're the kid, so do what I say. Um, there are conversations that you have to have with your kids that are completely uncomfortable to have. And there are conversations that should not necessarily uncomfortable, but they're just not pleasant. But as a parent, I think it's important to have conversations with your kid, not just tell them that, well, I'm the adult, you're the kid, so you have to do what I say. It helps with their education and with their growth if you have a conversation with them instead of just dictating to them. If you sit down and you talk to them and explain the situation, explain why we have to do this, and answer their questions as honestly as you can. Obviously, some questions, maybe if they have an inappropriate question, just say, hey, that's inappropriate. We're not talking, I'm not answering that, we're not talking about that. But if you it's important to speak with them and explain to them, because they have feelings too, and they have things that they want to do and that are actually important for them as well. And like you said, in the scenario, football is a good way for kids to learn. Sports teaches kids life lessons that last forever. So he wants to go play and he wants to play the sport that he loves. So why not talk to him and explain to him why he can't do it right at this moment, and tell him, hey, well, maybe we can't play for this team, but let's see if we can find another team out there. And if we can't, let's also see if maybe we can rearrange some things on our schedule to make it possible. Don't just make it a a finite no to where it's never going to change or anything like that, because then that discourages kids as well. So you have to have that conversation so that way they can understand. It's not about admitting something went wrong or anything like that, or being considered a bad parent or anything like that. It's just explaining to them why at this exact moment this isn't happening the way you want it to happen. So that way they can understand that I'm not doing this just to make you mad. I'm not doing this to keep you away from your friends or anything. This is something we have to do. This is an obligation, because those conversations, like I said, how sports teaches them life lessons that last forever, that same conversation will teach them lessons that last forever, because you're teaching them sometimes what you want doesn't align with what you have to and need to do. So you have to make adjustments to make everything fit.
You referenced, we're talking about involvement with Child Protective Services. You've referenced sometimes those particular conversations, depending on the topics and what's taking place within a family dynamic. You've referenced oftentimes that could be something that's uncomfortable, and those discussions could be somewhat unpleasant. I feel as though this is a great time to transition into our next subtopic. And we're talking about parent-children communication, but this particular subtopic centers on pedophilia. I mentioned at the onset of our first episode of the purpose of this particular platform, I did share that there will be times in which we're going to discuss things that could be somewhat uncomfortable. This particular subject is something that I am wholeheartedly comfortable talking about. And I've shared with people, at least at the time of this recording, you and I, we have a 13-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son, and they're both, with their birthdays being exactly 7 days apart, they're both in the process of transitioning into being our daughter 14 years old and our son 4 years old. I share with people, I've been talking with my daughter since she was 2 years old about pedophilia. And currently she's involved with, I feel as though that you've done a great job as a mother, and that's part of the reason why she's in the position, at least at the time of this recording, she's attending a private middle school, and they have a program with a private high school, and she's taking advanced science, technology, engineering, and mathematics courses through the high school. So the reason why I shared that, not to brag about the great job you've done as a parent, but I've shared that is when we're talking about pedophilia, the level of exposure to potential people, and we're talking about adults who present or perhaps they endorse features of pedophilia, with her going to essentially, she's spending time between two schools. Now she's also involved with basketball with multiple teams. She's been involved with cross country. She's involved with track and field. She's been involved with other sports. Point being is she's been around other adults, her entire life, in which they're not loved ones of you and I. They're not family members. They're not close friends whom we're comfortable with. And even along those lines, we're going to talk about victims of opportunity. We as parents, we unfortunately, because of the nature of pedophilia, we can never put our guard down. I've worked with countless individuals who present with features of post-traumatic stress disorder and other clinical diagnoses from sexual assault victimizations they've experienced. And I'm not talking about a couple of months ago or a year ago or a few years ago. I'm talking about 2, 3, in some cases even 4 or 5 decades ago. They've experienced some form of sexual assault, sexual battery related victimization, and they're still struggling decades later, literally. And I'm not exaggerating about this, unfortunately. I've met many individuals in which this is their life. And in addition to developing features of post-traumatic stress disorder, they develop features of various forms of agoraphobia, whether that be specific agoraphobia or something along those lines. They're scared. They're literally intimidated. They find themselves overwhelmed to be around others, to be in certain locations, even being in certain points in certain areas of their home. They develop various forms of agoraphobia with panic attacks. They find themselves overwhelmed with various forms of anxiety because of what happened as far as pedophilia. I pick my daughter up. I'll pick her up from, we'll just say, a basketball practice. Before we leave the area, she knows the questions I'm going to ask. I'm going to say, of course, how was practice? Did any adult say anything to you inappropriately? And hopefully the answer is always going to be no. Did any adult touch you in any manner? I'm not even talking about sexually. Of course, in basketball, there is physical contact, but she knows what I'm talking about. Did anyone touch you in a way that's not applicable to directing you as far as a basketball play and working towards winning the next game? The answer is no, and hopefully the answer will always be no. I'll say to her, did anyone do anything derogatory towards you in a sexual manner? such as grab themselves in front of you, such as showing you a picture, such as calling you over, say, "Hey, I want to show you this play," or my cellular phone. But it's not a play on their cellular phone. It's a private part. I'll ask her all those questions before we leave, because what I want to know, and she knows this, if something were to happen along those lines, as your father, I need to know immediately, so things can be taken, so things, the appropriate matters could unfold, so that could be addressed as quickly as possible. And I remind her, if something were to ever happen, your father needs to know yesterday. I don't want to know tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, 10 years from now. I need to know immediately so the circumstances could be addressed. I've asked many parents throughout my professional career, is this something that you discuss with your child or children? Surprisingly, at least to me, I've had a lot of parents tell me no. They avoid those particular subjects. And this includes parents, I'm talking about, unfortunately, women and men who've experienced some form of sexual assault victimization. So they've gone through this. They're wholeheartedly aware from a personal standpoint what this could do to you, not just physically, but psychologically. The physical wounds could heal over the course of time. Those psychological wounds, those emotional wounds, not so much. Like I just mentioned, these wounds could remain open over the course of not only years, but decades, depending on the circumstances, physiological makeup, and things along those lines. I've had parents tell me, no, this is something that I am very uncomfortable talking about. And I'll ask the parent why. And they'll share with me, what if something did happen? What if there is something taking place currently? And I'll ask the parent, wouldn't you want to know that? So law enforcement could be notified so you can handle the situation as a parent as you see fit. But wouldn't you want to know? And these will be circumstances in which a parent will tell me they actually wouldn't want to know. So I said, hypothetically, our children could be going through something very anguishing from a psychological standpoint, and you're unaware of it. I feel as though I at least offered a recommendation. I know everyone parents differently, but just from my professional knowledge of what pedophilia could do to someone from an emotional and from a psychological standpoint, I always encourage parents, of course, be as appropriate as possible as far as your language, but let's uh let's ask your children what's taking place. There's something called a victim of opportunity when it comes to, at least as far as contemporary criminogenic research. Sexual assault victims are generally, and I'm not saying this doesn't happen, as far as someone, we're going to say a high school freshman female, she's a part of the cross country team, so she goes out on a 3 mile 4 mile run every morning just to stay in shape and prepare for her competitions. I'm not saying it as far as those circumstances a sexual assault wouldn't take place, but contemporary criminal justice research highlights that when it comes to sexual assault victimizations, victims are unfortunately what's referred to as victims of opportunities, whether that be a coach, a teacher, a religious figure, perhaps even an uncle, an older sibling or cousin. In some cases, even a parent or grandparent. And throughout my career, I've worked with countless people in which everyone that I've just mentioned, in some form or facet, their perpetrator or their assailant fell along those lines. Very seldom have I worked with someone, as far as my memory goes, I don't think I've actually ever worked with anyone in which their sexual assault victimization took place just from a stranger, just from them being in an alley somewhere. And I'm not talking about any form of chemicals being mixed into a drink at a club or at a party, something along those lines. I'm talking about just being at a bus stop and someone approaching you along those lines. As far as my memory serves me, I've never worked with someone in which their sexual assault victimization took place under those circumstances. They were generally victims of opportunities. So especially going to the old adage of it takes a village to raise a child. We as parents, just like right now, you and I, at the time of this recording, you and I are at work. We're taking time to record this podcast. Both of our children are around other adults right now because it does take a village. We do need help. We do need assistance as far as supporting our children develop through life. So there are times as parents in which our children are not under our direct supervision. So this is why we must be very thorough. We must be very involved as far as what's taking place in the lives of our children. And we must be, just like the subject of this particular episode being parent-children communication, I at least feel as though we must be very communicative with our children. And from your standpoint, we're talking about pedophilia. Why do parents find it so challenging to talk with their children about pedophilia, which is unfortunately something that is of realization from a sociological standpoint? Why is it so hard for parents to talk about?
I think it's hard for parents to talk about that because it is, again, one of those hard conversations. But I think also it's because a lot of people, they don't want to face that it's a reality, that it actually happens in the world. Like it's hard to, for someone that does not have that affliction, it's hard for someone that to just say, to grasp why they like something like that, why they would hurt a child. So I think what it is that if you can't, as an adult, if you can't understand and grasp why it occurs and why it happens, then you're not comfortable having the conversation because you don't have the answers that may be asked for the questions that may be asked. So you don't want to sit there and say, I don't know, and well, we'll have to see, or something like that. You want to be able to give answers to questions that are given to you. But if you can't, in your mind, you don't understand why people do that, why someone is going down that road, why someone would choose to hurt a child or another person in that manner, it's hard to have a conversation with questions that you can't answer. So, and again, like I said, a lot of people don't want to accept that there are people in the world that do that. So they just, in their own small way, it's like, if you don't speak about it, it doesn't happen, it's not real.
Along the lines of our audience, I would like to mention that there is there's a textbook that explains psychiatric conditions, including substance use disorders. It's called the fifth edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I I read through that book very often, very frequently, and there's mentioning of pedophilia in that particular textbook. It talks about how pedophilia and corresponding behaviors are essentially psychiatric challenges. Now, despite them being psychiatric challenges, they do fall along the lines of criminogenic impulsiveness and, of course, corresponding reprimanding as far as the criminal justice system. And there are people who present with features of pedophilia and correlating diagnoses along those lines. They do have those proverbial wires that are, unfortunately, they are crossed. They do have that sexual attraction to children, to adolescents. And in some cases, there are some who like, and I'm not just talking about someone who is a young lady or a young man who's 15, 16 years old. There are individuals out there who have a sexual preference for someone who's just reaching puberty, for someone who's perhaps even prepubescent. There are some out there who have sexual attractions to toddlers. There are some out there who have sexual attraction to infants. So this is something that is a reality. This is why we as parents, this is why we must be very involved. We must be very active, even if you're not with the other parent of your child or children. As far as romantically, we must all communicate with each other. The subject of this episode is, it centers on communication. We must all communicate. We must all know what's taking place, who's around our child, what is our child doing right now, what do we have our child or children involved in. We must be very comprehensive, must be very thorough, be very communicative. Our children must also have an understanding that they can come to us no matter what's taking place, good or bad, and that we as parents, we're going to be there to offer that unconditional love, that support. You made mentioning of perhaps a parent being worried about not having answers. And us as parents, yes, there are times in which things could take place in which we do not have the answer. But what we can do as parents, A hug can be very powerful. An appropriate kiss on the forehead or the cheek could be very powerful. So at least we give that hug, we give that kiss, we cry with our children. We at least let them know that even if we don't have the answer or answers, I love you. I'm sorry this happened, and I'm going to do the best I can to rectify the situation, including potentially getting you any mental health or psychiatric or psychological help that you may need. And that's something that's very powerful. And where we will cover pedophilia as at least a subtopic during future episodes. Unfortunately, we've reached a point in which we must bring things to an end. So this will conclude this episode of the Dr. and Mrs. Curry podcast. Mrs. Curry and I generally hope that you found the information informative and that either you or someone you know could benefit from this platform. If so, think about liking and sharing this video. If you're not already done so, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, which is Dr. Joshua John Curry, ED.D, and hit that notification bell so you can be notified when videos and presentations have been uploaded. In addition to our parenting related podcasts, we have multi-systemic presentations that our organization concentrate on and upload to YouTube. Whenever you have time, visit our website, which is www.drcurryandassociates.com, which will connect you to our company, Dr. Curry and Associates. Look into viewing and following us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is at Dr. Joshua Curry. Thank you for taking part in this episode, and Mrs. Curry and I will catch you the next time around.